Troubling of a Star by Bryce Walton. This story, from a former writer for Alfred Hitchcock Presents, was only ever in print twice. First in the May 1969 issue of Venture Science Fiction magazine, then in the July 1974 issue of a French science fiction magazine called Fiction. Read by Darrell T. Smith II for my channel, Quasar Spectra. Troubling of a Star. Thou canst not stir a flower without troubling a star. After probing half the galaxy and 10,000 worlds, they gave up the search for life. All talk turned to Earth and women, and suddenly they had to go home. Reuben, the psychologist, looked into their eyes again. He gave them the tests. He agreed. They should go home and they should start at once. They had better forget the world on which they had just landed and begin preliminary tests. It was a sterile waste world, like the others. Forget it all. Go back. Emptiness without a shore comes back on you after a while, Reuben said. He was always saying things like that to Commander Cahill. The figures themselves were frighteningly incomprehensible. 30 trillion miles between the stars, and all of that space empty but for tenuous clouds of hydrogen gas. 100 billion stars in the galaxy, 10 billion other galaxies within sight, 1 million light-years between the galaxies, 10 billion light-years across the visible universe. But as far as anyone knows, it goes on out for whatever forever is, getting emptier. Airless, cold, empty, black, boundless. Totally hostile environment through which we move in our little life-preserving ship like goldfish in a bowl. Worse than hostile, it's indifferent, implacably indifferent, waiting only for time to strike. Oh, we're tough, Cahill. Sure, we're tough, highly adaptable, and we could keep going into this if we had just a little hope, encouragement, reinforcement, as we say, but we have had none. So what we've got is negative reinforcement, no life, nothing. Isolation and loneliness increase. Finally, the void leers, the emptiness sucks. You begin to have these old spooky thoughts again about existence. What am I? How did I get here? Why? Or what? Or it's time to go back then, to warmth, roots, family. Mother Earth, symbol and fact. Why not the womb? Said Commander Cahill. None of us were ever lonely there. That's part of it too, Reuben admitted. Anyway, the time comes when every man must go back. This is it. I don't feel that way. Cahill leaned toward the control board and snapped on the vision plates. Dust. Still nothing but that damn dead dust clouding everything. I know you don't feel that way, Cahill. Less dependency, that's why you were made commander. You kept it going a long time without discovery and encouragement. You could keep going a while longer, who knows how long, but we can't. And you can't go on alone. That's too bad, in a way. Cahill, who was shorter than Reuben, but half again as wide, shook his head slowly 3 times in intense frustration and ineffectual rage. His shaven head and face, in contrast to Reuben's hollow-eyed pallor, was space-burned to dark mahogany. While the others stayed longer in drugged sleep, Cahill had kept up his spacewalks on the ship's outer hull, those billions of stars so terribly bright in the black void that you had to shade your eyes. It's a big haystack, he said. 1 million intelligent worlds could be lost in it, but that world, millions of civilized worlds, are here somewhere, Reuben, and we ought to keep going until we find something. And what if we don't? Well, then what the hell's the sense of going back? Cahill flared. We'll still be alone in the universe for all we know. It'll be the same hang-up, won't it? Isn't that what the Earth is, Reuben, after all? Another spaceship? Rock and iron, crowded, bigger, maybe 6 billion trillion tons bigger, but just another spaceship going nobody knows where or why. And all alone, Reuben, all alone in the big, indifferent, soulless universe. What's the difference? To you, perhaps not much, Reuben said. Not yet, but for us it's now. Nostalgia, longing to go home, human nature. Empty, lifeless space makes it a matter of immediate personal salvation. They must go back to where everything once seemed, at least, to be warmth and security. Unconditional, it isn't there now, Cahill said. The only security is out here. Contact, interchange with others. That's the only hope. He stopped. Words were already used up and pointless. They had already outvoted him 4-1. Reuben shrugged and shook Cahill's hand, then joined the others in drugged sleep along the rear bulkhead of the control room. Cahill looked at them lying there in dream-drugged sleep. They had acted like children, eating their sleep candy capsules like kids and hopping into bed to be tucked in. Cahill had shared something childish with them once, that intense curiosity about what they would find. This was different. This was the innocent, trusting, dependent look of children who know that mother waits to feed, warm, rock, and soothe if they should wake up frightened in the dark. Cahill remembered Reuben's puzzled query. Doesn't the thought of those women bother you anymore? That one you used to talk so much about, Laura? Yes, Laura. He thought of her. The thoughts were sad and beautiful, often like pain. He could relive every moment he had known with her, no assist from dream-drugged sleep required. She had been very direct and physical, a lover of life and love. She had wanted to make love that last time in the desert mountains where the sky was clear under all the stars possible because they were where he was going. Yes, Reuben. The thought of Laura bothers me still. She was all women, not just my mother. He turned to the control board and went to work with the usual practiced skill, but now he moved with the detachment of a mortician forced to embalm his beloved. As commander, it was his obligation to make final preparations for shifting back and forth from regular to the antimatter energy drive that enabled them to jump between star clusters, and now back to Earth, somewhat faster than the speed of light. The journey would still take a while, however, and a body under ordinary conscious conditions wouldn't take the strain. He checked the drive units. He dragged out a protractor, heliocentric chart, photometer, astrographical and planetographical references. He rechecked ascension, declination, distance coordinates, detector relay currents, and cosmic drift. He fed the programmed coordinates into the computer. Figures appeared on the board. The ship, now in automatic drive, would blast out of this sun system and into antimatter drive in 7 hours and 2 minutes Earth time. That was a time schedule Reuben had warned them to observe with unfailing veneration. Maybe Reuben was right. And now go back, frail man. Reel yourself back fast on an overextended umbilical cord. Your challenge to the infinite and bitter night is over. He got the kit of 5 hypothermic injection syringes from the cooler. He gave the 4 dreaming men their final shots and sealed their cowlings. He set the alarms. Then he lay down in the commander's niche near the control board and started to insert the hypothermic needle into his arm. Instead, he got up and went back to the vision plates. Again, he opened them for a last look. Dust. More dust. The air and gravity were thin. The flatly worn surface of this world offered little obstruction to winds that formed continuous drifting whirls of dust, 5 to 10 miles wide, thousands of feet high. A small white sun shone through the dust, sometimes like a blind eye, but there was no sign of it now. Only those misty streamers of yellow light slanting down like light filtering through the water of a milky sea. Looked as it had probably looked for 1,000,000 years, like so many others, a waste world in a star cluster they hadn't even bothered to name. We came so far, Cahill thought, as far as man had barely managed to dream, and was this all they would take back? A report of thousands of G-class suns and planets circling with the useless, meaningless idiocy of powdery puffballs? They had seen parent clouds of hydrogen swam through vast clouds of primeval hydrogen atoms, the raw stuff from which all stars and planets and life must have been made. They had drifted past the swollen and reddened outer regions of aging stars and white-hot dwarfs shrinking into blackened corpses, seen the remains of dust-to-dust cycle of large stars, the rushing gas clouds of supernovas, and the luminous brilliance of stars in embryo. Thousands of planets suitable for the formation of nucleotides and amino acids, the building blocks of life. And it's here somewhere, Cahill thought. Life. Great and infinite varieties of intelligence and galactic civilizations. It has to be here. It has to have been here for billions of years, for the galaxy is at least 5 billion years older than the Earth. Figuring likely planets similar to Earth in favorable distances from a small sun, figuring them to be as rare as 1 in 1,000,000, the number of Earth-like planets would still number hundreds of thousands. That chain of physical and chemical reactions which led to the appearance of life on Earth had to have occurred on other planets. Intelligent life had to have developed, died, flourished, gone on for billions of years among the galaxies. "Where the devil are you?" Cahill pleaded. "Have we just passed one another in the night?" It looked the same, but the wind sounded different. Its gritty whisper over the ship's hull seemed louder, more abrasive, or perhaps a better term would be gnawing. A more eager gnawing, because that's what it was. Wind dust and sand gnaws everything away, given time. It dissolves the rock and solid strata, breaks, decomposes, gnaws away the high points, fills in the hollows, and that sand-blasting action of wind dust gnaws on across the surface, wearing and wasting. Cahill looked at his watch. He still had a little less than 6 hours before he had to give himself the needle. He flipped the tab of the data processing ticker and scanned the discouraging preliminary information they'd dug out of the planet before making the sudden decision to run home. It was what they called a terrestroid planet. It was composed of about the same mixture of rocky materials and nickel iron which makes up the body of the Earth. It was about the same size and distance from a similar sun, but it was a bit over 9 billion years old, over twice that of Earth. Some heat still radiated from remains of thorium, uranium, and potassium in the interior. This had extended the cooling time. Substantial amounts of water had covered the surface when it was young and had existed in abundance for at least 1 billion years. So advanced forms of life should have developed here. They had found no trace of life, now or fossil. No organic molecules in the rocks, no fossil records, no deposit of one-celled plants, algae, or shells of bacteria-like organisms. No hard-bodied animals, corals, starfish, snails, or trilobites. No tracks made in primeval slime by wriggling animal worms. There had been rivers, lakes, seas, mountains, and low hills. Now there were apparently no promising vertical structures at all. Cahill grunted and jerked the tape up closer to his eyes. This last part of the tape they had ignored because they had been crucially discouraged and had suddenly decided to go home. Maybe they had not even seen it. Beetle had been at the board then. He had said nothing, but here it was. Seismo probes had revealed faint volcanic activity from one small spot within a few miles of the ship. From this one small isolated sector came intimations of some moisture and possibly fragments of plant life. Cahill looked at his watch again, back at the viewplates. Slowly he ran the flat of his hand across his mouth. His upper lip was wet. Indecision seemed to last a long time. Then he moved. He still had a few hours in which to take one last look around. A gesture, one for the road. Anyway, they hadn't really given this one a fair shake. You have to walk on them to know. If there's anything, you'd feel it. Cahill had always thought that unless you walked on a world, you would never know for sure, despite the most sophisticated mechanical probes. This world deserves a walk, even a short walk, he thought. Even a small grain of salt contains 1,000,000 trillion atoms, and worn-out worlds and dying suns are the debris stuff of gas clouds that rush out from supernovas to form new suns and planets. He hauled his T-17 spacesuit from the locker and put it on. He clamped on the biopack, hooked up the automatic recorders and automatic high-speed micro-miniature cameras, and entered the airlock. He didn't look at the others. He hesitated again and looked at his watch, but what did it matter? If something happened and he didn't make it back to the ship in time, the ship would blast off anyway in 5 hours and 40 minutes. It would take them home. Cahill heard the dust wind, much louder now, grinding over his suit and his helmet. He checked his gauges and started away from the ship toward the reported direction of that faint volcanic life. He moved in long, practiced, low-gravity jumps. He turned up his mics to catch any squeaks or whistles of meaningful sound, but there was only star static and the irregular thud after each 10-foot stride as he landed with enough force to disturb the mics. An hour later, turned up nothing but more sand whirls and haze and flat desert, worn, porous, and crunchy under his boots. It was late evening then. Temperature dropped fast toward freezing. The air began to clear and the wind to die. Clear areas opened across the desert floor and in the overhead dust clouds. Where the sky appeared, it was deep space, black and blazing with that terribly bright star density of the galactic core. This world had no moon, but that luminosity of stars glowed on the desert through thinning dust like splashes of quicksilver. Some time later, he reached the edge of a sink. It sloped down gradually to a center depth of 30 feet and was some 50 yards wide. Along the bottom, in pools of silver starshine, lay a black, still river. Cahill studied it, aware of his slow, controlled breathing. He watched it. He listened. It felt alive to him somehow, but nothing moved down there except dust devils swirling along like smoke. The dust wind gritted very softly now around his helmet, and there was still no other noise but star static. But then he went down there, and it was like rubber balls rolling, crunching, popping under his boots. He crouched, and under the beam of his light appeared closely packed plants. Not black, but dark gray, mottled and shiny like a shark's hide. Pods the size of oranges in clusters of 3, with spiny, cactus-like leaves, all interconnected with tubular tendrils like seaweed or water lilies. The ground along the sink bottom was a bit warmer. A thin vapor clung there. Some moisture had frozen underground, and here, only here, according to the seismo probes, some of that frozen moisture melted due to very faint localized volcanic action. The moisture seeped to the surface in this one tiny oasis. It formed ground ice at night, melted a little during the days. Here alone, these pod plants clung to life. Beautifully adapted to their environment, the pods stored water to last during burning days, perhaps for spells of drought. Their tough, hard surface was impervious to the constant honing of dust wind, but their speckled hides, designed long ago as camouflage to blend in with gravel and rock, served no meaningful purpose now. They had nothing to hide from. Gravel and rock had turned to dust. Why? Cahill thought ecologically. Things lived for and on and about other things. Interdependence and balance. And if there were no birds, no insects, no reason for fertilizing soil or to oxygenate air, why these few lonely, meaningless acres of pod plants? Alone on a cinder, unaware of themselves, but struggling to live on with a fierce determination through fiery days and freezing nights, for who knew how many thousands or millions of generations? Reuben would say there didn't have to be a reason. Cahill cut off a large bunch of pod plant specimens and hooked them to his suit belt. He stood up and started to move out, but after 3 steps up the slope of the sink, he stopped and stood very still, listening. His mics were picking up a different sound. A kind of rustling and crackling. He couldn't tell if it was far or near, but it got louder. It sounded then as if he were rolling down a hill through piles of crisp autumn leaves. The sound swept, swelled, and expanded. It enveloped. Dark shapes appeared, moving against the starshine. They spread, interlocked, separated, and changed form and whirled about. They twisted around one another. They shrank into separate parts again and again, then recombined into larger shapes that bent and swayed like twisters, then shot up and spiraled forward and down, straight down at Cahill. And the sound increased to a vast swarming flutter like millions of tiny wings or leaves, a torrent of droning and humming. Cahill bent and sprang out of the sink. He ran in long, risky leaps toward the ship. Looking back, he saw thousands of tiny lights like pinpoints of energy that danced across the sky in changing, reforming patterns, like the lights of a gigantic multicolored switchboard. Flying sparks, dancing flame surrounded him. Something was everywhere over his suit and around his helmet. Something flickered over his visor and smeared vision. His boots tangled in strands of pod plant tendrils, and he fell blindly, rolling, burying himself in stirred dust as dense and fine-grained as powder. He struggled up to one knee. He waited, tense, blind. His visor began to clear. The dust slowly settled like plankton through water. Motes of light spread and vanished away in the air, dark now but for the starshine. Something moved, like a shadow at first, more of an outline of some undefinable shape. Then it was nearer, less than 10 feet away, and the shape was all too familiar. Cahill stared. He heard his breath and his heart going too loud and fast inside his helmet. "Laura?" He heard himself. It was a whisper half dead in his throat. "Laura." At that moment he knew a terror worse than anything he had ever known or could ever have imagined. The terror of losing his sanity. He remembered Reuben's talk about the spaceman's nemesis, autistic thinking. Desires or wishes that originate in deep personal striving are seen or felt as being already fulfilled, and contradictions with reality are ignored or unnoticed. "Where there's life, there's hope," Reuben had said, with his serious grin, "and where hope is desperate enough, it might create life." Cahill felt that suddenly and without warning, without a chance to defend himself, he had been seized and made mad. A woman stood there, tall and beautifully naked, with ripe, swelling breasts and hips. Near, waiting, breathing, her arms out full, her legs out, opening to him. And he thought he heard eager laughter, a whisper, but he could not really see her face. It moved, but was indistinct, like a smudged charcoal drawing. She was nearer. Her naked skin seemed to be multicolored fluff, or very tiny filmy feathers like those on the breasts of pigeons. All colors rippling, shimmering. Colors and designs shifted and changed. Hair flowed out wavering at right angles from her head on the wind, like something seen under water. It turned to flames that parted, sparked, came together like the flames of a bonfire. Cahill wiped his forehead shakily against the absorbent lining of his helmet. Then, with a great effort, he bounded up and leaped straight into the image. Thousands of tiny pattering leaf sounds swelled. Her body quivered and flamed in more vivid, rapidly changing patterns of color. Cahill's yell was hoarse and deafening inside his helmet as her body fell into a million tiny motes and flew away in all directions. He leaped away again toward the ship. The air everywhere was filled with that brushing and pattering and what seemed to be the lights of millions of fireflies. His visor fogged, despite its special coating. His face was wet. The drying unit in his suit wasn't coping with the increased flow of perspiration, and he wasn't dissipating enough of his body heat. He kept running, leaping in 10-foot bounds toward the ship. But by the time he reached the airlock and got inside, there was no sound around him, and there were no lights except those of the stars. He tossed the pod plants on the deck of the control room preparatory to throwing them into the specimen cabinets. He got out of his suit. He had 43 minutes before he had to give himself the needle, an hour and 43 minutes before the automatics took the ship away. He ran the Polaroid film from his suit cameras through the magnifier. It was all there. The woman, the flames, the disintegration into a million motes. He suddenly dropped the film and turned toward the vision plates, listening. He held his breath. But this time the rustling and pattering came from inside the ship. It was in the control room. Looking down, he saw the pods opening, and thousands of tiny winged insects fluttered out and filled the control room with multicolored clouds. Cahill stumbled back in near panic at the thought of what alien poisonous plague he might have so thoughtlessly introduced, and with no time now to do anything about it. They flew about the control room in wild, disorganized pattern. They formed into tiny clouds, then settled on the opened viewplates above the control board. There they began to crawl over one another in a slow, fumbling manner. They circled and crawled and formed and reformed in clusters of different colors and design. Cahill knew then what he was looking at. Parts of a human hand formed against the upper right corner of the viewplate. At the lower left-hand corner, an ankle, part of a foot, bits of toes appeared. A portion of breast, of pelvis, of hips, and fragmented belly. A jagged smear of partly completed mouth and face. Ragged patches and non-fitting parts of a woman's body. Cahill was out of time. He took the capsule. He got another hypothermic syringe from the cooler, lay down, and put the needle into his arm. He remembered then. The reference he had almost forgotten. He had shifted his interests from anthropology to zoology because he had preferred living things to dead ones, and one of the most fascinating things he had ever studied was the flathead bug, the incredible and astounding mimetic ability of insects. The flathead bug. Protective imitation is common enough in nature. The stick bug so perfectly imitates a twig that it has thorns on its back. Moths that live in trees exactly resemble the veined leaves. Another moth with a flavor too agreeable to hungry birds develops wing patterns that precisely imitate a species of moth those same hungry birds find too bitter. But the most incredible of all earthly mimetic genius was the flathead bug. Generations of the bug from Kenya in Africa had been bred for study at England's Cornedon Museum. When Cahill first saw it there, he thought it was a large flower, a coral-colored flower made of many small blossoms like a hyacinth. Each blossom was of oblong shape, maybe a centimeter long, but on close inspection it turned out to be the wings of many insects. A colony of insects clung to a dead twig and resembled exactly a large flower, a flower so real that bees were drawn to it. At the tip of this insect flower was a single green bud formed by insects of a different hue. Behind it were half a dozen partially matured blossoms showing only strains of coral. Behind these, on the twig, crouched the entire flathead bug society, all with wings of purest coral to complete the colony's creation and deceive predators. Cahill had stirred the colony with a stick. It flew apart. The air filled with the wild fluttering of flathead wings. They settled back on the twig at first with no special form, but in wild formlessness of what seemed random movement, but it was not. The flower soon formed again. The green ones had formed the bud. The others had taken their customary places all around. A lovely coral flower had been created again as camouflage. All it takes is time, Cahill thought dully as the drug pumped into his brain. Life, infinite adaptation, anything is possible given those vast amounts of time. How long for those colonies of flathead bugs to learn the instinctive ability to assume the complex shapes and colors of a flower? At least 300 million years. How much longer to assume the shape of a woman? For maybe 500 million years, those non-earthly insects had learned to seek safety in human form. Then something had happened to the humans, or those who had had human forms. And that could have happened 500 million, a billion years ago. How many more hundreds of millions of years had passed since the human-like intelligence whose shapes the insects had assumed had disappeared from this planet? And how? Why? Where? The insects didn't care. They held on as long as the pod plants lived to support them. Maybe they haven't even had to gather in human forms for millions of years, Cahill thought. Maybe this instinctive reaction was quiescent until they saw me there among the pot plants. Did I frighten them? Did I disturb them? Did I activate old instincts for survival? The last thing he saw before the cowling closed was the way they fluttered down dead over the control board and the deck. You've been listening to pre-1990s speculative fiction readings with a highlight on science fiction by Darrell T. Smith II. Please consider clicking the donation link in the description box. Thank you so much for your time and your imagination.